Unit 13, Part 1. Unit 13 is on complex subjects and predicates. We've just finished the long Unit 12, where we're introduced to categorical propositions. The complex subjects and predicates of Unit 13 are complex subjects and predicates of categorical propositions. So we're just doing more complex categorical propositions, symbolizing more complex categorical propositions. In Unit 12, what we worked with in being introduced to the basic forms of categoricals. Once again, there were four kinds of categoricals: universal inclusion, universal exclusion, particular inclusion, particular exclusion. Always categoricals are relations between categorical sentences. Sentences where the subject and the predicate are both classes, and that it asserts an inclusion or exclusion relation between those classes. And because of what categoricals are, there's only these four kinds, and they have their particular logical forms, right? The A, E, I, O, we saw those logical forms. But we only worked with simple subjects and predicates, right? Simple propositional functions like AX or SX, right, as subjects and predicates. This chapter introduces to more of the same, more categorical propositions, but with complex subjects and predicates. Let me open by saying that Klenk's opening line of Unit 13 is a lie. She writes, "If you understood Unit 12, you should have little difficulty with this one." It's not true. Unit 13 is quite complex, but rest assured that the level of difficulty of your exams will not be the same as the level of difficulty of the exercises, the examples she works out, especially towards the end of the chapter. But nonetheless, we do have fairly complex ones you'll be tested on. The reason why the chapter is hard is the overall lesson of the chapter, which does hold for most examples, is that it's the three-step advice. Remember the three-step advice she had for symbolizing categorical sentences at the end of Unit 12. She reaffirms that in a big way in Chapter 13, which is the three-step procedure for symbolizing is identify the overall form of the categorical sentence, right? Which means, is it A, E, I, or is it A, E, I, or O? Is it universal inclusion, particular inclusion, universal exclusion, or particular exclusion, right? You put that form in place, and the advice does hold for most of the examples we'll look at. You put that form in place, identify the overall form, then pick out the subject and predicate, and step 3, symbolize the subject and predicate. The picking out the subject and predicate and the symbolizing the subject and predicate of these sentences is much more complex when we have complex subjects and predicates, obviously. But that advice really is important. That is the main lesson of the chapter. And as I said in the lectures for Unit 12, the lesson is very similar to the lesson for translations in sentential logic. So think back to translations in sentential logic, right? Klenk and myself recommended a partial symbolization, right, with a specific methodology, whereby you identify. So when you have an English sentence, your first task is identify the major operator of the sentence, right? So if the sentence says blah 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 and blah 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 blah, and it's clear that that and is the major operator, right? So that the actual logical form of the sentence is a conjunction, then what you should do is, first step, partially symbolize. That is, have brackets where you write what is the first conjunct in English, all those words in English, right? Leaving all the logical words in place, right, as English words. So brackets, a whole bunch of English words, dot, brackets, and then the other conjunct, right? And the point of that methodology, right, was by doing that first step, you have laid down the logical form, the true logical form of the sentence to start the symbolization. And as you continue the symbolization, that correct logical form remains in place, right? You have a conjunction, you've got the dot, brackets on both sides, these are all English words, and then you symbolize each of those conjuncts. You say, okay, the left conjunct, that has to be conjunct, that has to be a sentence. What's the major operator there? Oh, that looks like it's a conditional. So you write a hook there for the major operator there, and symbolize the parts, perhaps partially again. But the point is, in that second step, the overall form will remain a conjunction, right? You've still got the dot and brackets on each side. So by not symbolizing, right, not reading if the sentence is blah, blah, or blah, blah, if only blah, 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 and if you just write those symbols one at a time, one after each other, it's very unlikely that the overall form of your final answer is going to be a conjunction, right? So you have to identify the major operator first of the English sentence and then lay that form down and keep that form in place through further symbolizations. Okay, so that was the lesson for sentential logic. Keep that in mind, because that's really what the main lesson of this Unit 13 is, right? The point of that three-step procedure is to identify the overall form of the sentence, lay that form down, and keep that form in place, right, as you go on to symbolize the subject and predicate, right? So if you have a big, horrible categorical with very complex subjects and or predicate, very complex subject and or a complex predicate, if you recognize the overall form of the thing as, say, universal inclusion, you should set down the form, lay down the form of universal inclusion, right? For all x, brackets, and then a hook, right? And then plug the subject and predicate in words, right, in English words, partial symbolization, into the subject and predicate place of the form, right? So, identifying the form, forget about this stuff for a moment, but you lay down this form first, and this might be, right, big, long, complex subject. Left-handed tennis players who like to eat candy, blah, 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 right? But whatever that subject is, you can write that in English, but you've laid down the place that it goes, right? You might have a complex predicate. What about them? What about these left-handed tennis players that like to eat candy? They usually lose on Thursdays when something, something, something. It's complex, right? It's going to require a lot of symbolization. But the point is, you've got the overall form in place first, and your final answer, the final symbolization, will be of the right form, right? Universal inclusion, because this is the logical form. The for all x and the hook is the form of the universal inclusion categorical. Okay. So that is the main lesson of the thing, and we will stick to it for most examples. But the reason why this is such a hard chapter is because the advice does kind of break down towards the end, with the examples at the end.